Hey there, I'm Jen Kiaba. I'm a photo-based artist here in New York, and today I'm going to be taking you on another walkthrough of one of my images. Today we're going to be talking about incorporating different pieces of stock photography, whether it's yours or stock photography that someone else has allowed you to use to create spaces that don't exist in reality. So I'm going to take you through a shoot that I did in my backyard, and I'm going to show you how I pulled in other images from other shoots that I had done to create a space that did not exist in reality to bring my vision to life. So I hope that this is going to be exciting for you, because what you're going to be able to do now is begin to envision new fantastic spaces and think about ways that you can bring them into the reality of your photograph as well. So this is the image that I created. It was shot, like I said, in my backyard, and so there are elements of my yard in this image. It was a self-portrait done in the rain, and originally I had thought that I simply wanted to have the images of my backyard be a part of this final piece. And then as I was going through and building the background from multiple shots of my backyard, I realized that it really didn't have any deep meaning to me. I had created this pose that was kind of looking up at the rain, and I wanted it to be this pose of reverence for nature, and the rain didn't really translate well on camera, and it just was falling flat for me. And so what I decided to do was look at other images that I had in my stock library to see what I could bring in. And this was a process of trial and error, and it was a process of kind of futzing to see if different pieces could go together enough to create something fun. So this is one of those images that strayed pretty far from my original sketch and ended up being something completely different than I had imagined. But the fun part of that is that art gets to take you on a journey. So I basically strapped in for the ride and was all about seeing where we could go. So this is the final image, and I want to take you through the shoot really quickly so you can see what we started with. This is the main image right here that I used. This was a self-portrait on a 2-second timer, and I was using the Canon Connect app, which I've mentioned in a couple other videos. The cell phone is actually hidden in the folds of the cloak, so this is one of those images where I did not have to Photoshop it out, which was great. And then these are some of the other images that I shot of my backyard just to try to get enough images that I could composite together into a whole, into a square format. As you can see, this is a construction zone too, but what I was really compelled by, and here's my cat, what I was compelled by was the this wall, the wetness of the wall, the gravel that was going to go underneath this stone patio that was kind of in process. And I think here I'm just taking pictures of my cat. She likes to follow me on all of my photo shoots. And so that was kind of where we started off. This again is that final image. And this is again the image that we started with. So what I did was I started to pull in some of those other background pieces that I liked to see if I could begin to build something that was workable. So I'm going to show you what that looked like. And again, this is not going to end up being part of the final, but this was the process to get to that final. So I'm pulling in different pieces of the background that I had shot and just kind of placing them together. See, one of the things that I really did like originally was you can see some of the water drops that I'm catching here. And I think my original idea with that was trying to get this sense of sparkles and water droplets and maybe even fireflies, because again, this is this pose of kind of reverence and looking up. And at the end of the day, it didn't feel like it worked for me. So what I had done here is you can see with a number of layer masks over here, I had begun to craft something that looked like it sort of matched. And so what I did with the image of myself here, if I enable this layer mask, is I began to mask out the pieces that I didn't need from the pose. And I'll disable all of my layer masks here so you can really see kind of what a hodgepodge this was, and the beauty of working with layer masks here to start to blend different pieces together. So if you've never worked with a layer mask before, it is such an amazing new thing to be able to incorporate into your workflow. The way to create a layer mask is to select the layer that you want to work on, and then you go to this button down here which looks like a circle within a rectangle, and you just click it. It'll create a layer mask here, and then what you do is with a brush you're going to either paint in black to mask something out or white to bring it back. And the important thing to think about here is the hardness of the brush edge that you're using. So when you're in your brush tool, if you go up here, you can see that there's some brush presets, and you've got the hardness slider right here. And so if you are cutting out a figure and it's a really hard line that you need to cut out, your hardness is probably going to be up in this higher range. Whereas when you're doing blending, like I'm doing in this image here, I ended up using a lot of soft edges because of the fact that I wanted to sort of look for places where things would kind of naturally merge together. So let me show you what a hard edge would look like really quickly. Let's see if I enable all of these again so that they're workable layers. Let me turn off the person and find which layer is going to be the best one to demonstrate for you. I think, which one is it? I'm trying to find the right one for you right now. So I'm turning things off and turning things on. This is a huge process for me, by the way, when I do composites. Sometimes there will be stray marks that I'm like, where did this come from? Or something that I need to figure out. And I will literally go through and turn layers on and turn layers off. So I found where I want to show you, I think. We'll just do a quick demonstration. So a hard-edged brush here through the middle of the ground. You see how that is creating a really hard line. Now if I want to bring that back, I can just go over here to toggle my palette, or you can use the X on your keyboard and that'll toggle as well. So with a white brush now, I can go back in and bring this in. If I go back up and I bring my hardness down, it's going to create a very different line. And so I really like to use soft edged brushes to do a lot of the blending work for a background like that. So that is just a quick demo here. And if I bring the figure back in, that's how I was able to create this background. It's not 100% seamless, but it is close enough. So what happened here was I saved the image at this point, and I was looking at, again, if we zoom into it, and I use my hand tool here, you can see that there are these water droplets up here, and I really liked them, but they just didn't seem to be enough in my image. And there are a number of different ways that we could have gone with this image at this point. I could have brought all of my greens down and made it kind of a darker background, and then if I had painted in more water drops or something like fireflies, they really would have stood out. But to me, that didn't feel like where I wanted the image to go. Some things that I liked, I really liked the pose, but I felt like the wall was too modern for this cloak that had kind of a timeless feel to it. And so there was this anachronistic quality to the image at this point that even if I were to bring in fireflies or fairies, it just didn't feel like it worked for me. So what I did was I actually ended up taking the figure out here and creating a stamped visible layer. So I believe it's Command Option Shift E on a Mac. I need to learn what it is on a PC so I can say that going forward. Again, apologies that I don't know what it is on a PC. But I created this stamped visible layer here to kind of just say, all right, what am I gonna do with this? I want to keep the figure, where do I go from here? So the next thing that I did was I played with the exposure and I brought things down, because I think this was at a point where I was taking that mental path of like, if I make this darker, could I start to bring in the fairy lights, etc. And I wasn't sure where that was going to go. What I did instead was I pulled in some ruins that I had photographed on a trip down to Tulum, and I loved the wall here. I just thought it was really beautiful. It had this kind of, it had that timeless look that I was going for, but I also struggled with this idea of, do I just want it to be a figure in the ruins? And I did think too, there's something kind of political about putting myself into ruins of another country. That's probably not 100% appropriate. And so I started to think about, well, what other elements could I bring in? I really liked this line that was created right here. It had this nice compositional effect. It also kind of breaks the composition into the rule of thirds a little bit as well, but without it being a completely straight line. It brings in slight dynamic angles to it. I had thrown the figure on in an isolated layer, and the way that I did that, just for anybody that's curious, is with those layer masks. So I duplicated the image with the figure. So even though we had it down here, I decided to just bring it in again. So by doing that, I was definitely creating more data for my computer to process. But this is part of the figuring it out as we go along process. I was saving everything down here, everything down here in a background group. So you can select a bunch of layers and then on a Mac hit Command G, and that'll create a group. And what that does is it allows you to kind of toggle things on and off. So if I were to just take out all the background, this is one way for me to kind of keep track of what I'm doing. And so for me, I wanted to kind of keep the possibility of having that old idea intact in case this didn't work. So that's why I created a new figure here, brought her up here, and this is where a hard-edged brush on the layer mask really worked better, because there are places where you can see it's not perfect, but if I had used a soft brush, and let's just give that a shot, a soft brush, let's toggle over to black and make sure to be in your layer mask. Painting on anything other than the layer mask is going to create problems. So see this soft edged brush here? What it does is it just sort of fades the figure and she starts to look ghostly. Whereas if we were to bring in the harder edge, what that does is it creates a very hard edge. And what I don't like about it, if we zoom in even closer, is it starts to create this kind of like chunk that comes out of the figure. So you see like that, where there's you see the circumference of the brush in there. Then you start getting all of these different little chunks in there that I don't like. I'll deal with my color profiling later. So this is where finding that middle ground in your brush hardness is really important. So let me just take a couple steps back here. Whoops. All right. Where did I go? Here we are. All right. Let's zoom out here. So I brought you to this point right here. We brought in this new background, and I was just showing you the figure and how we did the figure. But really, in my mind, I'm still stuck on the background here. So what I decided to do, again, because we look at the figure here, there are a couple of problems that this creates for me. One is that the figure is looking up, but there's really nothing in the composition for the figure to be looking up at. What is her motivation? What is the purpose of this image? This is something that I think is really important for us to figure out. And this is where I see a lot of artists go wrong in compositing, is that they're bringing in a lot of elements that symbolically try to tell a story, but they're not tying them in together very well. And so it becomes a lot of disparate objects. And in this case, this feels like disparate elements. So the figure looks very out of context with this background. Additionally, this window here created a problem. Now, I could have just cloned that window out with my stamp tool. So I hit S on my keyboard, but your stamp tool is right over here. And then I would probably use a soft edged brush, and with Alt on a PC, I know this one, or Option on your Mac, you can start to clone it out. And so now we don't have the window anymore, because that was definitely pulling focus. You have to remember, in a composition, the brightest things within it are going to draw the eye. And so that window had become a focal point in my composition. But even if I had cloned it out, it was still a problematic composition in that I have this background and I have this figure and they're not interacting enough. Why is this figure kneeling on the ground, looking up in supplication? What's going on? What is the story that I'm trying to tell? And so I got inspired to pull in another image from a cave that I had explored. And I really liked this. I felt like this was the right direction for me to go in. I loved how these vines in here created all of these lines leading the eye up. This also helps become a focal point as well. And then there's this really interesting depth of the cave that I liked. But one of the things that I felt needed to happen was that cave opening needed to become smaller. So what had happened is that I had brought this cave image in and then I'd stretched it. And the way that I had done that is by hitting Command T and then just literally dragging it. So what that does is it expands your pixels, and in some cases that can be kind of a big no-no. And I'm going to zoom in here just so we can see. And it doesn't look like it's really expanding the pixels in such a way that it's detrimental to the image, but you have to be careful. Your image needs to be large enough to be able to kind of account for that expansion. And so what I had done is I had brought a piece of the cave back in. So let me just turn this off here. And let me show you without the layer mask. I'm going to disable it. This was the actual cave image that I had brought in. And I'm just going to turn off all of these other layers so you can see specifically what I'm talking about. We'll have to go through and turn them back on again, but I think it's an important thing to demonstrate. So this is the cave image, right? And what I had done, like I said, is just hit Command T on my Mac and then expanded the image here. And so that's how we got to the background. However, again, I felt like the cave opening was too big, and so that's why we layered in the image again. And so this is where the soft brush on the layer mask is really nice, because it's helped to blend these two images in together. So let me just bring back my background. And another thing that I had done was just brought in another piece of a wall from another ruined site. Now you can see there are areas where I kind of didn't clean it up enough, and this is going to be problematic for me later, and I'm going to have to stamp it out later. So this is another reason why I highly recommend, when you're doing composites, to turn things on and off, because what happens is we'll kind of get so focused on a specific area when we're trying to clone stuff out that we will not see these stray objects here. So let me just show you what these ruins looked like. And so I was so focused on getting this piece here in the wall that I missed these pieces up here. Let me turn that back on. And so going back there, I'm very tempted to kind of clone these out, but I think that I got them later on. It's just that as you begin to build layers, and especially if you start to stamp visible, it's going to create issues. So when you're working on your backgrounds, this is a really good time to turn things on and off, toggle it, and just see where you have stray stuff going on. So now we have the finalized background and we have the figure. And this is another area where a composite can go very wrong, is that the light doesn't match, right? Because the figure was photographed on a rainy day, so very cloudy day. There is slight directional light. You can see on the chin there that there is some shadow, so the light's from overhead, but it's very soft and very diffused. Now, the light here is just too omnidirectional right now for what would be streaming through a cave right now. So there's a couple of things that need to happen. First, I need to try to make sure that the exposure of the figure matches this background so that she doesn't look like she's pasted on, which she does right now. And then I'm going to need to work on making sure that the light feels appropriate for the light source. So some of the things that I did, utilizing a clipping mask, which means that when you've clipped an adjustment layer to something, it's only going to affect that layer. So you can see right here, this little down arrow means that the layer has been clipped. So what I'm doing here is I'm just bringing down my midtones and kind of getting rid of some of my shadows, bringing it more into the grays than in the blacks to see if that helps a little bit. I'm also playing with my color balance a little bit here because you see the figure is a little bit oranger, and I figured that in this space it would be a slightly bluer, more ghostly light. And then I just went crazy and brought my exposure down and tried to do some gamma correction as well to just make it so that the figure was just overall a little bit darker. And this was a good place for me to start, but it wasn't enough. And so you're going to see a lot of the stuff going forward is now really about trying to get light to match and to make it seem like more of a seamless environment. So what I did here was I brought my exposure way down, especially in the darker midtones. You can see where I've got some issues from some stray background right here. Now what I've done with my my layer mask is I have masked out the areas that I would sort of feel like the light would hit a little bit more. So if I disable the layer mask, you can see that that just brings everything down, right? If I enable it, we've got what's sort of a halo of light here on the ground where the light would naturally hit with this kind of light source through a cave opening, and then I've got it on the figure as well. And here what I'm doing is I've got most of my second curves layer masked out, and I'm really trying to see, can I get it so that the cave opening is not quite such a hot spot, and also focusing on some hot spots on the dress and the hands. Because of the distance between the light source, the lap and the hands would naturally have a little bit more fall off than what I was getting there. And then in another curves layer, what I'm doing is I'm starting to play with my colors to see if I can get them to blend a little bit more, because the colors here, while I like some of the greens in them, I wanted to see if I could get something that was a little bit more timeless looking. And so what I'm doing here is with my RGB, which is all of my channels, I've again bumped up my shadows a little bit. I've brought my highlights down, and then I've just done a little bit of an S curve here on my midtones. But where this effect is coming from is mostly in each channel. So you can see here on the red, if I bring this down, it's a little bit bluer. So when you pop something above this line on your red channel, you're bringing in more reds. And then by bringing my highlights down, I made my highlights a little bit bluer. In my green channel, I kind of left it mostly alone. It looks like what I've done is I've pulled my greens down a little bit in the highlights, which is bringing us more into the magenta range. And then on the blue, I've brought my blue shadows up. So you can see that's bringing up more blues there. And I've also brought up the blue highlights here too. So just playing with that. And now we're going into a dodge and burn layer where I'm really trying to kind of get everything to blend a little bit more, and also think about where I want the eye to go versus where I don't want the eye to go. So the ground really was too hot for my taste, And so what I did is I started bringing in some shadows. Now, I've talked about how to create a dodge and burn layer in past videos, but if you've not seen them, I'm just going to walk you through it really quickly. So you create a new layer, and you can name it dodge and burn. I'm just going to leave it at layer 15. You change your mode from normal to soft light, and then you fill with a soft light 50% gray. It's a neutral color. And what that does is it gives you a layer that's not affecting anything at the moment, but when you go in with a brush, either with a black brush or a white brush, you're going to create non-destructive dodging and burning. And the reason that I recommend doing it like this is because you can undo it later. If you were to go into any one of these layers here and use the dodge and burn tool, which is, where is it? I never use it. There we go. There it is, all the way down there. Wow. Okay, can tell I never use these. If you were to use these on a layer and then you decide the next day after you've saved and closed your image, or even after you've gone far enough that your history tool isn't tracking it anymore, because your history tool is only going to track a certain amount of steps here. So because I've only been going through this image to do demo, you can see where open is. So we've got everything tracked, but at a certain point, these are going to start to fall off and you're only going to get recent history. And so if that happens and you realize that your dodging and burning is not doing your image justice, what's going to happen is that you're going to have to start pulling layers apart and redoing things. Whereas the beauty of a dodge and burn layer here is that if I decide this doesn't work, I can either go in with a 50% gray brush and paint stuff out, or what I can do is I can mask things out with a layer mask, or I can just create a new layer and try again. So anytime you can use non-destructive practices, especially when you're compositing, I highly recommend it. So with the dodge and burn layer, I also always recommend with your brush tool to use a low opacity, because let me just demonstrate for you at 100% opacity, it's basically like painting something on, which is not what we want. But if we use, let's say 20%, 16% opacity, you can see that this just creates a nice little bit of burning in here. So I'll delete that layer. So with this dodge and burn layer, actually I kind of liked that. I wish I had kept that. With this dodge and burn layer, what I'm trying to do is focus the eye a little bit more. And now here, what I've done is I've rendered some lighting effects. So I created a new dodge and burn layer. And let me actually just run a dodge and burn layer. I've saved this as an action here so that my lazy self can just click a button and have a new layer. So what I did here was I rendered lighting effects. So you have to have a layer with data on it in order to do this. But you go to Filter, Render, Lighting Effects. And I went through and I thought about how does light come through an opening like in a cave. And so what I did is I played around with some of the different lighting tools that they have in here. So you can see there's a number of these coming through. And you can choose a number of different lighting effects here. And so what I had done was chosen the one that I felt really worked the best for what it was that I was trying to do. So you can see there's a whole bunch of different things that you can play with. But for me, I was looking for a very specific effect, which was not this. I'm not sure which one I would have chosen, but if you go through and you play with these, you'll definitely be able to see how they render different effects. So I'm going to hit cancel here. And I'm going to delete that dodge and burn layer that we created for this one. But you can see that it created a nice little lighting effect here. Now, what I've done is I've gotten much more specific with my light. And I also tried to create a rain effect, which didn't really work. But if we zoom in and we turn this on and off, this is on normal, so you can see with my layer mask, I've painted out everything that's not just a soft stream of light coming through. Don't name things rain if there's no rain on the layer, but maybe that was my intention and I just went with it. So with the different blending modes then, I really tried to see what would create this sense of soft light streaming through. So you can go through and you can play with different blending modes. Soft light is usually my go-to, but we can see that soft light wasn't really doing quite as much. So what I ended up doing is putting in screen. And you can see that's pretty extreme for this. It was probably more than we needed. And so I believe what I had was an opacity of 10 here, which creates just a nice little stream of light. And then I rendered mist. So if you've seen my previous walkthrough, I showed you how to create what's called difference clouds. I'm going to do a quick walkthrough of that as well. Create a new layer, which is this little post-it notey thing down here. And what I did is I filled it with black, white, whatever. Go up to filter, render, difference clouds. Ta-da, we have difference clouds. Next, what I did was I went into the filter again and I did a Gaussian blur. And you can choose whatever radius you want that you feel like gives this enough blur. You can see if we go to a pretty high radius, it's very blurry. If we go down pretty low, we're not getting that much blur. If we go all the way up, it pretty much averages everything out. So choose something that you feel like works for you. I'm going to do a pretty high radius right here. And then what I had done, and I showed you in the last tutorial as well, is I hit Command T to do a transform. And then I right-clicked and I did perspective. And by doing perspective, what it does is it creates these leading lines to some degree with this layer. And so what it ends up looking like is that the mist is a little bit closer to the viewer and then it kind of fades away up into the distance. And you can see that I had created a layer mask over here to mask out the areas that I didn't want there to be mist. And I had put this on a soft light blending mode. So you can see the reason that I had done the layer mask is because it's creating these points of light up here that are pulling the focus, right? And part of creating composites is really teaching the viewer where you want them to look. And I want the viewer to be looking at a triangle in the middle of my composition. And I'm actually going to draw for you exactly what I'm talking about. I do this a lot for my students where we talk about composition and I'll draw the compositional elements. So this, oops, let's go a higher opacity here and let's do this on a new layer. So new layer, compositional lines. This is really where I want the eye to be focusing, even a slightly tighter triangle here. And then the figure is a triangle within the composition. And so anytime you're creating images, it's really important to think about what are those various lines, right? And we talked about also the rule of thirds. So we've got this really interesting line right here, and then the line of this cave back here creates another line, right? And then we've got the lines that are created by the opening and the hands. So we've got all of these compositional elements kind of coming into play here, and that's what helps create a dynamic image. And so part of this is really about focusing the light and creating that sense of where the composition lies. So that is a long-winded explanation as to why this doesn't work here with the mist, but this does a little bit more, where I've actually started to blend things out. So I'm going to delete this layer. And now we've got another dodge and burn layer where I'm actually focusing that in even more. And now I've started to apply texture. So this is a texture that I photographed and I give away on my, my newsletter list. And I'll include a link to that in the notes here. What I loved about this is that this created a texture that the mist layer wasn't creating and my rain layer wasn't creating as well. So let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at this. I'm going to hit H for my hand tool to kind of move us around a little bit. So you can see that the texture has not only been applied in terms of color, but also in terms of the grit that this texture had created as well. Now, for me, it's really important to not get texture on skin wherever I can. And so I'm going to teach you a quick trick to get stuff like that off of skin. So what you're going to do is you're going to create a new file really quickly. And it can be whatever size you want. It really doesn't matter. Let's just do 400 pixels by 400 pixels. Create. And we are going to fill this with a 50% neutral gray. So we're going to go in here. And now we've got this gray square, right? And we are going to go to Edit, Define Pattern. And we're going to name this gray. Hit OK. And now you can close this out. You don't even have to save it. What's going to happen here is I'm on my grunge layer. We go to my healing brush tool. Instead of sampled, so normally the healing brush is similar to your clone stamp in that it's going to sample all the data around it, and then it's going to create a healed version based on the pixels around it. By using a pattern, what we can do is ignore all of the default patterns. This is the new pattern that we created. This is an old pattern that I had. What we'll do is by using the tool, you can see how it's removed all of the grain and the grit and the grunge from our grunge layer in this area. So obviously I want it here. I'm going to go back, but by doing this on skin, we are able to have the skin be free of that texture. And so what this looks like now is it looks like rain or gunk falling in on the figure as opposed to creating that texture on the skin. So I use this all of the time when I'm using texture, and it's a really great trick. So from here, again, all I'm trying to do is get my colors to a place and get my figure to a place where I feel like everything really blends nicely. So I'm starting to play with my colors again. You see how this blue here was brought in. What I could have done to remove the blue is to literally just turn this into a black and white layer. But instead what I did is I started playing with my color balances to bring some of my tones back to a more neutral place. Now it would be interesting to see, let's just experiment. If I use a black and white layer, and see how this layer affects everything right now. If I just use this here, this is the clipping mask button. Now it's clipped right down here. So this is what the image would look like if the layer was just black and white versus the blue. And part of me actually still really likes the blue. But I think what would have happened here is that I would not have been fighting quite so much with these color balance areas if I had just done a black and white layer. So you can see what I had done with these color balances is started to bring in a lot more of my yellows and my oranges to try to get everything back to skin tone. So this is why normally what I do is I make my textures black and white when I bring them in. Sometimes it's fun to see what the texture can bring to an image in terms of that color, and I did like the ghostly blue light, but I think I just made the executive decision to move on from there. So tip for you is that if you don't want to create color casts from your textures, make them black and white before you bring them in or after you bring them in with a clipping mask. So here with my first color balance, whoops, what I've done is in my midtones, I've just added a little bit of blue and a little bit of red. Shadows, I used a lot more yellow over here and just a tiny bump of red. It's probably not even doing much. And in the highlights, same thing, just bringing up the yellow. And then in this second layer here, in my midtones, adding a bit of red and a bit of yellow, or a bit of blue. Can't talk. Bit of blue and a bit of red. Highlights, I think actually what I've done here is I've just duplicated the layers. So again, this is work that maybe I didn't need to do, but did because I chose to keep the color of the texture. Now a couple of more textures of mine that I had shot. This is, let me just show you what this one looks like here. On 100% opacity, This is, I think this is a baking dish that I had shot, and then I did make this black and white, and I kind of really brought everything down in the darks. You can see right here, this is where I have used that healing brush tool with this stamp pattern here. So it's not affecting our figure. Let's go back to soft light and bring this back down to 78 where it was. And here is another texture. And you can see this one here, I've only got down at 20%. But if I show you what this looks like, you can see I've really masked out the, not masked out, but healed out the figure pretty extensively. And so this is another baking dish. I think this is actually the same texture that I've duplicated, and I'm just playing with the black and whites to see where I can kind of manipulate the image a little bit more. So let's bring this back down to 20% where that was, put that back on soft light. And now this is a modified action here called Ghostly. Let me see if I have it still in here. Okay, I think I'm gonna have to see if I can link to this. I am never going to be able to pronounce this correctly, so I'm gonna try, and you can laugh at me. Leave here beige foggy action. So I think this is the dreamy haze action that I used. I'm gonna look this up after I'm done recording, and if I can find them, I'm gonna put a link to this action in the notes. But I think that's what this one is right here. And I renamed it Ghostly. And I modified this in after having run it, but it'll just show you right here. It's a number of color balance curves and gradient fills that have created just a slight foggy look to the image here. You could probably do something like this with a curves adjustment. So let's just see if we were to use our lasso tool, and let's feather by, let's say, 250 pixels. And if we were to, whoops, if we were to not do that, I'm going to hit shift to add. My tablet is tiny. I've got an old bamboo tablet here, so trying to circle all of this. There we go. All right, let's try this again. So what we've done is we've created a soft edge, and if we run a curves layer here, you can see that what it's done is it's created this soft edge in our layer mask. And so we could probably start to play, and you see how what that's doing is that's creating a lovely beam of light here. And you could go in, and with your RGB channels, you could start to play with the colors as well. So this is a hand editing way of doing it. What I had done at this point is I had literally just run an action, but you can see that even just with a curves adjustment, we're kind of doing the same thing. So this is, I love actions. I think they're fantastic. I also think that it's really important to learn to hand edit so that you understand what's happening to your images, and you don't rely on them as crutches. So in this case, I did use somebody's action because I thought it did a really nice job, but you could do the same thing with, again, a curves adjustment with a soft edge and changing your colors. So a little bit of a tip there. So this here is just my attempt with a couple of layers of soft paint with my brush tool to just bring down the hotness of this cave opening here. And then the last thing that I did is I ran this Holgeroid by Raw Image. I think that's the name of it. Holgeroid, where are you? Yep, Holgeroid Color by Raw Image. I will also post a link to this action as well. Talked about this in a previous video. What this action does by default is it makes your image size much smaller. And again, I like to be able to print large. And so what I've done here is I've actually gone through and toggled various things within this action so that you can see these are areas that I can tell it either not to change the canvas size, things like that. And what it does is it messes up the border that's put on at the end, but I delete the border anyway. And so, you know what, let me just run this action unmodified for you so you can see what it looks like. So I'm going to go to Image, and I'm going to duplicate my image, hit OK. And now what I also do is I flatten this image here. So I go to Layer and then Flatten Image, because the way that the action is built, it cannot handle all of the disparate layers that I've already got in there. Hit OK. And so that's how I start with this action. And again, this sort of goes back to the point of, you know, do you hand edit images or do you rely on actions? And some actions need a layer to, or need everything to be flattened in order for them to run, because otherwise they don't know where in the layers to apply different adjustments. So learning to hand edit is super helpful. So I'm going to run one of my unmodified ones, and I don't remember if it was type 88 or type 89 that I ran. I'm gonna go with type 89 because I'm guessing that that's the one. These output two slightly different images. One is, I think I chose the right one. One has slightly browner, yellower tones, and then the other has slightly bluer, purplish tones. And so you can see this is at 100% right here, and this is at 25%. So we've reduced the file size by a lot. But the thing that I love is, so I get rid of the frames and the fringe. And actually I usually get rid of the vignette, and I play with my curves because it's a little extreme here. But you can see, now I'm going to close this out. Don't save. When I throw the Holgeroid back on, it's kind of purplish yellow. So I've made some adjustments here with a color balance layer that was not part of the original action, and I've tweaked my color fill, and I think I've left the curves and the brightness. There's a grain that comes with this action as well, and then a photo softener and a lens aberration layer. And if I were to, actually let's just keep this here. If I were to turn off this photo layer, you can see that what it also does, oh, actually in this case, so now I wish I hadn't closed the other one. Part of the Holgeroid action is that it creates a pinch, and what that it attempts to do is mimic an old lens where there's generally a sweet spot and also some interesting aberrations. And by modifying this action, I'm actually not letting it pinch here, because what it was doing was distorting the figure and also distorting the wall behind here. And so I actually kept that. I kept that out, rather, of the image. And then the last step that I did, I was really happy with where this ended up being, but the last thing that I did was I brought in a new opening, because I felt like this was just too high up. There were a couple of things that I was thinking about. One was, if I were to print this, the opening to the cave is right there at the top. It's like almost literally touching the edge. And if I were to map this up against the image itself without any kind of like border around it, it would feel like it was creating unnecessary tension in the composition by literally almost being off the page. And so I just decided what I would do was go back and because by this point I have actually created stamped visible with the Holgeroid action. So I think what I did is I went in and kind of created a copy of this with the opening of the cave in a different place and then pasted it in. This was like I don't want to undo all the work that I've already done to get here, so this was a last minute adjustment. So this is the final image that we ended up with, and we have come a long way from where we were in my backyard. So I hope that this was really helpful for you. The main thing that I wanted to share with you, not only, you know, some of these tips that I've learned along the way in terms of non-destructive editing and how to hand edit certain things or modify actions that I've really come to love and rely on as part of my workflow, but also I really want you to think about compositional elements within your images and how you can create something out of various images, how you can pull in different elements to create something brand new that didn't exist before. This is a perfect example of my creating a space that is fantastical in some way. It's believable in that there are certain elements that we're used to seeing, but it's a place that doesn't exist. And I was able to take the image out of my backyard and into my imagination by using a few simple extra elements and a few simple Photoshop tricks along the way. So I hope this inspires you in your photography and in your art overall, and I would love to see what kind of fantastical places you've created out of your imagination. Please feel free to share them with me, and I look forward to doing another walkthrough with you soon. Bye.